Welcome to another Control Hobbies tutorial. In this video, we will be discussing the available options of the RF menu. We will be covering the following topics: binding types, multi-receiver binding, channel stacking, channel mapping, multi-receiver telemetry, and receiver telemetry speed. You can access the RF Set menu from the base menu. In the RF Set menu, you will manage all RF and telemetry communications between the radio and receiver and bind your model to the radio. Each time you create a new model, you will access the RF Set menu to bind your radio to the model's receiver. Depending on your radio model, you can bind up to 4 receivers to your model. The binding process requires you to place the receiver in bind mode. This is done by pressing the Set button on the receiver, and after 2 to 3 seconds, you can tap the Bind button on the radio. You need to bind RX1 first. When binding is successful, the RX column will show the channel count of the receiver. Below it, the current receiver firmware version is shown in small letters. For example, a GR16, which is an 8-channel receiver, will show as R8, and a GR12L, which is a 6-channel receiver, will show as R6. Please note that if there is no version displayed under the channel count, you are using an old software version on your receiver. You will have to update your receiver to ensure compatibility and proper operation. You can check for the latest software version on our receiver resource pages, where you will also find detailed binding instructions for your receiver model. The Telemetry Select column will be checked by default, indicating that this receiver will send telemetry information to the transmitter. Unchecking it will stop the telemetry data transfer between the receiver and transmitter. You can bind your receiver in 3 different ways. The default setting is model bind. A model bind is a bind that will only respond to the model it is bound to. It is an exclusive bind between the currently loaded model on the radio and the installed receiver in the model. The radio will automatically assign the first available bind ID when a model is not yet bound. This example shows that C1 will be used as the bind ID after the model is bound to the radio. You can change the bind ID by tapping on the bind group icon. This brings up the binding groups dialog from where you can select your bind ID in case you want to change it. In this example, the bind group dialog shows that positions 0 and 4 are already assigned to a model under the letter C and should not be used. The model bind method is the safest and most common way to bind a model to your radio. It can protect you from an accidental and uncommanded operation of your model when a different model is mistakenly loaded. The next available bind method is group bind. A group bind enables the receiver to respond exclusively to the group ID assigned during binding. For example, if you bind a receiver to bind group A0, that receiver will not respond to a signal from the transmitter of a model memory that was bound global, for example, as group C2. You can bind another model memory also under bind group C2, which will result in one model memory sharing 2 receivers under a single bind. When both receivers are turned on, they will respond simultaneously to the same control inputs of the transmitter. The use case for this is, for example, during competition, when one airplane becomes inoperative, and you would like to continue the contest using an identical airplane without switching model memories on your transmitter to avoid losing time. All you need to do is power the other airplane and wait for the receiver to establish the bind. The last available bind method is global bind. A global bind enables the receiver to respond to the transmitter signal on a non-exclusive basis. What this means is that any other receiver that is bound as global will respond to the transmitter signal of another model memory that was also bound as global. This can be used in situations where you have multiple models that are all the same and do not need different model memory settings. Unless needed, we do not recommend using a global binding for safety reasons. Tap on the bind group icon to change the binding mode to global, and then bind your receiver. Depending on your radio model, you can bind up to 4 receivers to your radio. By default, they will be operating in parallel, mirroring each channel on each receiver. You can use receivers with different channel numbers, like an 8-channel receiver with a 6-channel receiver or any other Graupner HoTT receiver. You will need to bind the first receiver to RX1 before binding additional receivers. To bind the additional receiver, you have to turn the RF off and bind the next receiver. In this example, we have bound an 8-channel receiver and a 6-channel receiver to our radio. The 6-channel receiver is highlighted in blue, indicating it is the default receiver from which the radio will receive telemetry information. If you need to change the designated telemetry receiver, tap on the receiver that you would like to use for telemetry. You can use both receivers for receiving telemetry information during flight by assigning a control to switch between the receivers. We will be covering this later in our video. When multiple receivers are bound to the radio, they can be stacked, appearing as one single receiver with multiple channels. For example, when stacked, an 8-channel receiver and a 6-channel receiver will show as a 14-channel receiver. You can use any combination of receiver stacking to increase the usable channel count. Please note that you will need the most current firmware on your receiver for it to work. You will need to have at least 2 bound receivers for stacking to work. To stack a receiver, tap on the receiver you would like to stack, which in this example is RX2, to select it. Tap again to bring up the RX2 channel dialog. You will notice that the channels are numbered 1 to 6, which is the default for a 6-channel receiver. Tap on the Reset button to stack the receiver. This will automatically renumber the channel count starting with the following available channel number, which is dependent on the previously bound receiver, which in this example was an 8-channel receiver. If you want to unstack the receiver, tap on the Reset button again, which will remove the previous channel renumbering. Stacking receivers can assist you with simplifying your installations, providing a more manageable and better scalable model setup. This example uses 4 receivers to set up an airplane to control 16 channels. We use a single receiver in each wing to directly control ailerons, flaps, landing gear, and navigation lights. The only wiring coming from the fuselage are the power wires to power the receiver. This creates a very clean and manageable installation, which reduces the chances for defects and provides a level of redundancy in case one of the wings fails during flight. The possibilities are endless when using receiver stacking, and we highly recommend trying it out. Sometimes we need to map a channel to another channel to accommodate certain installations or peripherals. If you have only one receiver bound to the radio, we recommend using the output swap function in the base menu. However, if there are multiple receiver installations, you may consider using the channel mapping functionality in the RF Set menu. For example, when we have an installation where the secondary aileron, which is by default mapped to channel 5, is connected to a different receiver, we will need to map that receiver channel to respond to channel 5 control outputs. To map channels, tap on the receiver you want to map to, in this example, RX2, to bring up the channel dialog. Assuming that the secondary aileron servo is physically connected to channel 10, we tap on the channel 10 field and use the bottom arrow navigation keys to scroll through the channels and select channel 5. Note that using the output swap menu may provide better functionality, especially with newer software releases. If a model has multiple receivers, you can monitor the telemetry from each receiver during flight. You do this by assigning a control switch to channel 16 to cycle between each receiver. When a second receiver is bound to the radio, channel 16 is automatically designated as a control channel to cycle between the receivers. While the receivers do not have to be identical, they need to have the same telemetry modules connected to the receiver to avoid false telemetry alarms. Please refer to the radio reference manual for further details. You can deactivate the telemetry for a receiver when switching between the telemetry output select channel in the telemetry select column. The current telemetry values are shown on the widget menu when switching between receivers. You can also add voice notices to enhance further the real-time information received from your model. The link below provides several model samples that show how you can implement this functionality and even automate cycling between receivers. In those situations where two models are operating at close proximity to another, and controlled by two separate transmitters, you may choose to reduce or eliminate the telemetry back channel of one of the models to avoid potential interference. For example, in drone operations with two operators where one controls the drone and the other the payload using a separate transmitter, you should consider reducing or removing the telemetry from the payload receiver to minimize potential interference at greater distances. The same would apply to airplanes that tow or carry other airplanes that fly close to another. Experiment with the proper telemetry period value for your situation. You can reduce the amount of telemetry data transmitted back from the receiver to the radio by tapping on the Telemetry Speed button to change the values. This concludes the RF Set menu tutorial. We appreciate your time watching this video. You can find additional information such as range testing and other RF options in the reference manual. We recommend subscribing to our channel to receive notifications of new tutorials, and if you have any questions, do not hesitate to reach out to us.